Hello, welcome back. I hope you're well. Today I want to do the classics book tag. No one particularly tagged me, I just really like talking about classic books. Question number 1 is name an overhyped classic book. This I've chosen Picnic at Hanging Rock. This is probably one of Australia's most famous books, and I tried to read it and watch the film and couldn't finish either of them. The book is set in Edwardian times in the 1900s. A group of girls from this school go on a picnic to Hanging Rock. Some of them go out exploring further. These girls are seen as like the popular girls in the school, and then they mysteriously disappear. The premise sounds really intriguing, and the time period is something that I really love reading about, but I found both the book and the film were really plotless, and I know it is meant to be this kind of atmospheric, spooky kind of story, but that wasn't really enough for me. I wanted to know a bit more. The book itself I found kind of weirdly constructed. It started off like the film, just talking about the schoolgirls and their disappearance, but then it kind of moved on to these other minor characters, like a random family who live nearby, who has a son who like saw the girls go off into the bush because they were also at Hanging Rock, and then he becomes a bit obsessed. There are a bunch of other random characters, and it just kind of talks about them for ages and ages, and I just eventually gave up because I couldn't really see where the book was going or what was the point of these random side stories that weren't actually to do with the disappearance of the girls. Pretty sure in the end they don't ever find out what happens to them anyway, so I didn't worry about finishing either the book or the film. I'd love to know from someone who really does love the book and the film, because I know it is hugely popular. The second question is, what is your favourite time period to read about? Mine is definitely the 1800s, probably because most of the classic books I've read have been set in that era. So obviously Jane Austen is at the beginning of the era, around 1810s, and you get people like Elizabeth Gaskell and the Brontes, and then also Charles Dickens writing a bit later on in the Victorian era, all the way up to books like The Railway Children, which was written in the 1900s or late 1800s, and those children's types of books set in Edwardian era I also really love. Aside from just being a very familiar time period, I think I really like it because it is still quite close to our own time. With the 1800s, it's really interesting. They thought of themselves, as far as I can work out from the books, as a really modern age, and science and innovation and new ways of thinking were really celebrated in that time. It's really interesting to see, even with Elizabeth Gaskell books written in the mid-1800s, how they think of themselves as so much more advanced than people in the early 1800s, and that's only 50 years. They thought even of their society as being so much more progressive. A lot of the characters from that era of classic novels such as Jane Austen and the Brontes, the heroines are always really modern, and that's why they remain classics, and it's why people still want to read them. I always find it really interesting to read about a character who could imagine living now but forced to live in this other time when women had it a lot harder. I also love the clothes from that era. I love watching adaptations of books from that era, and I have a real fascination with the way society worked then. I always find societies where there are much more rigid rules about how you're supposed to behave really interesting, because the drama of the stories becomes how the characters get around these rules, or how they interact within the rules of the society to still, find husbands that they like. So in short, the 1800s is my favourite era to read about. Question number 3 is, what is your favourite fairy tale? Mine is Hansel and Gretel. I didn't grow up with Disney films. My mum is quite anti-American. She really doesn't like American voices, and she can't stand Disney songs, so she didn't really let us watch them when we were kids. My exposure to fairy tales was from more of the original tales from Hans Christian Andersen and that kind of thing, and I always really enjoyed Hansel and Gretel. I think purely because of the gingerbread house. I just thought that was the best thing ever, and I think I always preferred stories about children as opposed to people falling in love, because that's not something I was particularly interested in when I was a kid. I remember we had a really creepy stop motion puppet version of Hansel and Gretel, which I also really enjoyed watching, even though it was super scary. The fourth question is a classic that you're embarrassed to have not read yet. I'm pretty embarrassed not to have read any Virginia Woolf yet, as obviously she's a great feminist writer and a lot of people love her, and I tried to read Mrs. Dalloway and just couldn't get into it. The style of writing was just not something that I found easy to read at all. I'd really like to read A Room of One's Own, as I feel like as that's more of an essay, it might be a bit easier to read. and then hopefully read some of her other books from there. Question 5 is, what 5 classics would you like to read soon? So I wrote a list. Number 1 is Shirley by Charlotte Bronte. I love the Brontes and yet hadn't read all of their books, which is pretty bad of me. So I'm currently reading The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, and then I just have Shirley next to read. And the only one I won't have read then I think is Villette. I tried to read Villette and just didn't enjoy that. Second on my list is The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton. I haven't read a lot of American classics, so I'm quite curious to read that one. Next is Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. Again, just another famous book that I haven't read. And my sister studied at school. She said it's really good, and she doesn't read a lot of classic books, so if she likes it, then it must be good. The next 2 on my list are Australian classics. So there's Monkey Grip by Helen Garner. That's more of a modern classic. I think that was written maybe in the 60s, and that's a really famous Australian novel that I definitely should get into. Helen Garner is one of our more renowned authors. And then the next one is The Harp in the South by Ruth Park, who's also quite a famous Australian author. I have read her children's book, Playing Beatty Bow, which is set in Sydney, and that was really good. 6th question is, what is your favourite modern book based on a classic? So my pick for this is a book called Wendy by Karen Wallace. This is a book I read ages ago as a child, and it is a version of Peter Pan from the point of view of Wendy. It's not really Peter Pan version as such, it's just about Wendy and her family. I don't remember if Peter Pan actually appears in the book. Sort of takes a look at Edwardian family life and pictures her parents as not getting along. I think her father is like cheating on her mum in the book or something. It's quite a sort of like serious young adult type book with a lot of like issues in it, and I just remember really enjoying it as a kid. I think I got it out of the library several times. I'd love to read it again, but I may read it and find it isn't actually that good, which would be a bit sad. Number 7 is, what is your favourite TV or movie adaptation of a classic? Obviously, I have to say the 1995 version of Pride and Prejudice with Colin Firth. I have watched that adaptation since it came out when I was 2 years old, at least once a year. My family, it was a tradition of ours to just sit down and watch it. We had the VHS box set until the DVD came out, and then recently my parents bought the updated DVD, which had like extra special features. We are obsessed with that show and we can quote all of it. I think what makes it so good is it really brings alive the characters. There's just little added scenes like where Lizzie is running about the countryside, going for walks, bits of Darcy where he's walking around and you sort of get to see his perspective a bit more, and every actor in it is absolutely superb. I have so many other favourites as well. I love the North and South adaptation. I have Little Dorrit, Bleak House, Wives and Daughters. There was an adaptation of that in the 90s. The Emma telly movie with Kate Beckinsale is incredible. I could pretty much make a whole film on adaptations, which I might because I could go on about them forever. Number 8 is, what is the worst adaptation you've ever seen? The worst one definitely was an adaptation of Mansfield Park starring Billie Piper. Firstly, Billie Piper's hair was dyed blonde and her eyebrows were so dark, and it just was so distracting. I mean, it's set in the 1800s. They're not going to be dyeing their hair blonde, especially not the character of Fanny. It annoyed me so much. And Billie Piper, as good an actress as I'm sure she can be, she just did not suit this role at all. I think Mansfield Park is a very difficult one to adapt. When reading it, it's more Jane Austen's writing that keeps it interesting. But I'd love to see a really good adaptation of it one day, hopefully. Number 9 is, what is your favourite editions of classics to collect? Mine's definitely the vintage classics. I always love their covers. They're so innovative and I feel like they really suit the stories. I'm not one of those people who has to collect the series in the same edition though. I kind of like having different books in a series or author from different publishers. I think it makes my collection of books more sort of eclectic and interesting and gives them a bit more of a history, especially if I bought them from secondhand stores. Last one, number 10, is, what is an underhyped classic? This I chose Howard's End by E.M. Forster. E.M. Forster is most famous for writing A Room with a View. If you haven't read A Room with a View, you might know the film adaptation with Helena Bonham Carter. Howard's End also has a great adaptation starring, again, Helena Bonham Carter and Emma Thompson. Would highly recommend that film. It's almost as good as the book. It is about two sisters called Margaret and Helen and their relationship with this family called the Wilcox family. So Helen and Margaret love arts, they love music and theatre and books and culture and that kind of thing, but unfortunately they don't have a lot of income, and this is in contrast with the Wilcox family, who do have a lot of income but are incredibly practical and sensible and don't really understand why these two sisters love the art and music that they do. The characters are really well portrayed in the book. They are really well drawn. The story isn't like a huge plot-driven story, but there's enough in there to keep you interested, I think. And yeah, I think if you are a fan of the sort of traditional 1800s classics, you would definitely enjoy E.M. Forster as well. That is the end of the tag. I hope you enjoyed the rest of your day, and I will see you soon. Bye!